Welcome. This is a wonderful occasion for all of us. Everybody in this room has admired Mike, loved Mike, been a student of Mike's, been a colleague of Mike's, worked with him in all kinds of contexts. And so the amount of affection and respect in this room is as high as it has ever been, Mike. Pat, Sovern, I'd like to introduce. I know there are a lot of family members here, but please stand up and let us recognize you as well. So I think we just get right to it, and Mike's going to read from a chapter first, and then I'll come up, we'll have an exchange, and from there we'll go to the audience. Mike?
Thank you, Lee, for that generous introduction. I'm glad I came. I'm glad you came, too. Thank you. There's so many wonderful friends and family here. Thank you all for coming. One of a teacher's great joys is seeing his students succeed, first in the classroom, and then after he has turned them loose on an unsuspecting world. Chief Justice Harlan Fiske Stone had the pleasure of welcoming one of his most brilliant students at Columbia, William O. Douglas, to the Supreme Court. I've had the pleasure of welcoming one of my most brilliant students, Lee Bollinger, as my successor to lead this great university. He is, as many of you know, an authority on the First Amendment and a passionate advocate for the values it exemplifies, and so it seemed only fitting that I choose for my brief reading this evening an excerpt that recounts Columbia defending free expression at considerable risk. Besides, I think it makes a good story, and I hope you will agree. Joan Connor, the dean of the journalism school, called me with surprising news. Salman Rushdie was willing to come and speak at Columbia. This at a time when Rushdie was still living under armed guard to protect him from assassination. His novel, The Satanic Verses, had prompted Ayatollah Khomeini to issue a fatwa, condemning Rushdie to death and calling on all zealous Muslims to execute him. The journalism school had a perfect occasion for Rushdie, a dinner celebrating the 200th anniversary of the First Amendment. But Dean Connor was quite properly consulting me to be sure the university had no objection to her pursuing the possibility. We both knew that a Rushdie translator in Japan had been murdered and that another in Italy had barely survived an attempt on his life. What implications would a Rushdie appearance have for the safety of Columbia's students and staff? Would we have to live in fear for an extended period? I told Dean Connor I needed to know more. What I learned was that Rushdie had made a few limited appearances in the United Kingdom without any consequences for the places at which he had appeared. And Columbia's security chief assured me that our relations with the New York City Police Department were such that he was confident that working with them, we could protect Rushdie. I told Dean Connor to take the next steps, but to keep me informed. Within a few days, I received another surprising phone call. A mutual friend had been asked by Lawrence Eagleburger, then Deputy Secretary of State, to have me call him about the Rushdie matter. When I did, Eagleburger explained that negotiations to obtain the release of Terry Anderson and the other hostages being held by Hezbollah in Lebanon were close to success, and that an appearance by Rushdie in the United States would derail those negotiations. Moreover, Eagleburger wanted to be sure I understood that people intent on killing Rushdie were very serious and that they wouldn't care about collateral damage. I certainly didn't want to be responsible for preventing the release of people who had already endured more than 6 years of harsh imprisonment. but there was a real possibility that the hostages would be released before we had to make a final decision about Rushdie. Eagleberger and I agreed to await events and stay in touch. Happily, the hostages were released, and we proceeded with our plans for a Rushdie visit. But how were we to get him here? No commercial airline would carry him. The British had an official flight to Washington every week. If they would take him, we could handle the rest. But they wouldn't do that without permission from Washington. It was time for a call to my new friend, Larry Eagleberger. He was mindful of my cooperation when he needed it and willingly signed off on Rushdie's traveling with the Brits. An American company agreed to lend us a corporate jet to fly Rushdie from Washington to New York. A combination of Columbia security, the New York City police, and absolute secrecy would presumably take care of the rest. A few days before the event, admittedly quite belatedly, I began to worry about those attending the First Amendment celebration. We were exposing them to risk of harm if an attempt were made on Rushdie's life, and we were doing so without giving them any choice in the matter. They would not know that he was scheduled to appear. To make sure my conscience wouldn't go quietly, Caroline Kennedy was among the evening's speakers. Causing harm to any of the evening's participants would be unforgivable, but adding to her family's tragedies was unthinkable. To help me work the problem through, I called Punch Sulzberger, then the publisher of the New York Times and the co-chairman of the evening. He was one of the few who knew Rushdie was coming. We agreed that I would notify each of the evening's program participants 24 hours in advance and offer them an opportunity to withdraw. None did. And we reassured ourselves that the quality of the security to be provided was as good as it gets. On earlier occasions, we had helped protect a number of heads of state and government whose lives were at risk, including Rajiv Gandhi, whose own security, sadly enough, later failed. I needed reassurance on one other score. Our guests included several hundred journalists. What would save us from several hundred cell phones spreading the word of Rushdie's whereabouts as soon as he appeared? I tested this space myself. No cell signal could penetrate its thick walls. Don't take yours out, please. We were using I was testing a technology that now seems quite primitive. This was more than 20 years ago. But it was clear from my rough experimentation that when we gathered here for dinner, no one outside would know what was happening inside. The evening arrived. An armor-plated, bomb-proof car brought Rushdie from his hotel to Columbia. A curtain parted, and not far from where I'm standing, flanked by 6 armed plainclothesmen, Rushdie stepped to the podium. It was the first time I had ever heard several hundred people gasp in unison. He spoke feelingly and eloquently, and here's a bit of what he had to say that evening. I'm quoting. "Sometimes I think that one day Muslims will be ashamed of what Muslims did in these times. We'll find the Rushdie affair as improbable as the West now finds martyr burning. One day they may agree that, as the European Enlightenment demonstrated, freedom of thought is precisely freedom from religious control, freedom from accusations of blasphemy. Maybe they'll agree, too, that the row over the satanic verses was at bottom an argument about who should have power over the grand narrative, the story of Islam, and that that power must belong equally to everyone. That even if my novel were incompetent, its attempt to retell the story would still be important. That if I failed, others must succeed, because those who do not have the power over the story that dominates their lives, power to retell it, rethink it, deconstruct it, joke about it, and change it as times change, truly are powerless because they cannot think new thoughts. One day, maybe, but not today. That's the end of that particular passage from his talk. And then we spirited him away. The First Amendment had a fitting send-off for the beginning of its third century. Thank you.
Well, I mean, I guess it's important to say that I've never had any controversial speakers. So it's, you know, so that's one way in which we differ.
Oh, good.
So Mike, let's start with the motivation for writing the memoirs. You know, how did you come to that conclusion? How did you start? What was the process? You're not the first to write memoirs, but you're one of the best. How did you do this?
Thank you. I might be the first this week. Yeah. I started it in a spirit of play. I thought a couple of my grandchildren are here tonight, and I thought maybe someday they'd like to know what the old man did. And so on stray moments on weekends, I'd scribble out some thoughts. And then classical academic experience. Somebody reminded me that the Rockefeller Foundation has a beautiful retreat on the shores of Lake Como, where one could apply for a chance to do some writing. And so I did, and I was invited to spend 4 weeks in the most beautiful part of Italy. And to my shock and horror, the place has a great work ethic, so I got a lot done. And then I was rolling. I just kept on going.
It's interesting you say about your grandchildren as a motivation. I recall this is like 3-4 years ago, maybe 5 years ago, and we had an event at the president's house, and you spoke. And I can't remember quite why it was, but you spoke. And one of your granddaughters was there. And I was talking to her afterwards, and she said, that was really great. I've never heard my grandpa talk or give a speech before. And I thought, boy, I mean, you've given thousands of speeches, but to get to a point in life when you're not giving speeches anymore is really quite something. How about...
I should interrupt long enough to tell you, she's here tonight, so obviously it worked.
Yes, it did. I think I want to get to what we've talked about many times, but to Columbia, its history, your experience, I mean, you have 60 years with this institution, so it's really important. But I want to say something just to begin, to affirm what a special mind and person, what mind you have and person you are. When I came here as a very young law student, you were a star in every sense. The youngest tenured member of the law school faculty ever, recounted in the book. And it's really been an enormous pleasure to be associated with you. So I want to say that. So let's go to Columbia. So the narrative of Columbia that I often say, and you've agreed with, is that at some point mid-century, Columbia became the greatest university in the world. And then it went through a series of very unfortunate events and circumstances, something around the '68 period and the related era, and then the decline of New York City in the 1970s, some issues of how the university was managed in this period of time. And by 1980, when you became president, Columbia's fortunes, literally its fortunes, but metaphorically, had fallen very significantly. And I have said, you have said, I don't think there's any university in the United States that has had the history of highs and the lows as much as Columbia. And under your time as president beginning in 1980 and going to 1993, Columbia began its ascent back up. So let's start, if we could, with your time as a student. What was it like? What was that period in the 1950s and then the 1960s as the greatest university in the world?
It was a glorious place. The teaching was outstanding. As ignorant as we freshmen and sophomores were, we knew that we were being treated to performances by wonderful scholars and teachers. What we didn't know was that the place had suffered an interregnum, and you and I would subscribe to the proposition that the president of the university matters, right?
Absolutely.
Nicholas Murray Butler, who was a great university president, had stayed too long and then essentially forced to retire. And then the trustees courted Dwight Eisenhower to be Columbia's president. And that was a great coup to get him. The problem is that process took several years. And then he was, after only about 2 years in office, drafted to be the head of NATO, and then, of course, ran for president of the United States. So you have Butler's old age, the interregnum, the Eisenhower years, and then the trustees chose a president who turned out not to be a great leader. And so you had a period of drift. And that, of course, leads into 1968, and then the spending down of the endowment and repairing the damage of that period. And so when I become president in 1980, we're virtually broke. We had this wonderful jewel of the land under Rockefeller Center. It was a kind of booby prize that the state legislature had given Columbia in the 19th century. The legislature had made cash awards to a number of colleges in the state and didn't include Columbia. Trustees huffed, puffed, and lobbied, and so they gave us this rundown old piece of property outside of town. As the city moved north, of course, it became enormously valuable. So we owned that. It was subject to a lease that was made in 1929, and by 1980 was not very productive, scheduled to last until 2050 something. And so one clear possibility was to sell that land. Wonderfully valuable piece of real estate. We weren't being able to do, to realize what it was worth. And ultimately we did. It took years. But we sold that piece of land for $400 million in the early 1980s. At that time, United States Treasuries, if you can imagine it, were paying 11% a year. It was the period in which Paul Volcker was squeezing inflation out of the economy. And so we were getting a very nice return, did that for a year or so, and then put the money into the stock market and rode the bull market up. So that was really the means by which we were able to finance so much that we needed to do: preserve need-blind admission, rebuild the faculty, repair the physical plant. Most of you will have come up those beautiful stairs from College Walk to walk into this building. Those stairs were about to slide down when I became president. And one of the fascinating projects was they were taken out one at a time. The infrastructure was replaced. They were put back. And after that project was done, it cost $1 million. You couldn't have told anything by looking at it. And that was, we repaired roofs and walkways. And the Rockefeller Center land was a big part of what made all that possible. And of course, we did what university presidents do. We started a capital campaign. And then we got lucky. And we were lucky to have the Rockefeller Center land, but we had another piece of good luck. The United States Congress enacted the Bayh-Dole Act that enabled universities to patent and exploit discoveries that had been paid for with federal money. And so we did that. And God bless our creative faculty. I have to mention Richard Axel, One in particular, medical, now a Nobel Prize winner, though he hadn't yet received that award back then. His patent generated roughly $1 billion over the years. And so with those three income streams, we managed to start to climb out of the hole.
Yep. And what were the big decisions in that period of time? Let's go right to the how would you want your grandchildren and others to view your time as president here?
Well, it was to, well, I guess I should take a step back. I think as I look back, probably the most important thing I did was to, I hope, generate a sense of what values are important. As I say in the book, students have a keen eye for hypocrisy. And so a university must live its values, openness, freedom of expression, integrity. And I'm happy to note that that still is the case. But then, of course, there are the actual academic decisions we made, attracting outstanding faculty to come to Columbia. We had suffered some serious losses in the wake of 1968. That student uprising generated considerable animosity among some segments of the faculty. And perhaps one of the most important factors that determine where a faculty member works and lives is what he thinks of his colleagues. And if a department is riven by anger and angst, it's not a good place to be. People will leave and replacements won't come. So we had to do a lot of rebuilding on the faculty side. We had to be sure we retained the need-blind admission in Columbia College. And again, I'm glad to note that we still have it. It would have caused me enormous pain if I was presiding over a university that didn't make it possible for people like me to come here. And so that was a very high priority, and I'm happy to say still lives. And of course, we had to work on the physical plan. And we did add some new buildings, not as many as you're adding, but in addition to rescuing the old ones.
And the going co-ed.
Oh, yes. Thank you. I hated the fact that Columbia College had no women when I was a student. We called them girls then. And so the chance to admit women to Columbia College was just irresistible. The difficulty, there was no significant resistance here on campus. The difficulty was that Barnard had come into being because the Columbia trustees refused to admit women. And the idea of doing something that might savage them was just unthinkable. And so it took quite a long time to work out a modus vivendi. The president of Barnard at that time was Ellen Futter, now the head of the Museum of Natural History. And Ellen was a former student whom I knew and liked. The chairman of the Barnard trustees was Helene Kaplan, an old and dear friend. And so we had the kind of working relationship that held real promise. And we did. We worked out a plan that would guarantee that Barnard students would continue to have free access to Columbia's courses, that their faculty would have opportunities to work across lines, and that library facilities, and that we would publicly underscore the importance of the relationship. I would joke, and it worked. Barnard survived quite nicely, thank you, it's thriving today. And I would joke that if I had been president of Barnard at that time, I would have had a simple recruitment speech for prospective students, remembering from my old children that 17 and 18-year-olds are not exactly anxiety-free and sure of what they want to do with their lives. I would have said, if you'd like to go to an all-women's college, Barnard is the place for you. If you'd like to go to a co-ed college, Barnard is the place for you because you go right across the street. And if you don't know what you want to do, Barnard is the place for you.
You say in the book, and everybody, including me, says about you, that the highest kind of function in life is to be a teacher. And you are and were a great teacher. You continue to teach, and basic legal method that students take when they come to the law school. Could you just talk about what it's meant to be a teacher, why you love to be a teacher? What is it that's so fulfilling?
Sure. Well, I think I begin with the idea that the surest sign of one's own growth and maturity is the satisfaction in helping others to grow. And as you know, I now teach a course that in law school we called legal methods. When I was a student, we only called it legal method. We've since discovered other methods in the 60 intervening years. And I have the fun of teaching a 3-credit course in 3 weeks, 3 hours a day, 5 days a week for those 3 weeks. And the joy of seeing the difference between those students from day one and the end of just 3 weeks is just wonderful. I mean, it's a teacher's dream.
Yeah. So let's go to your outside activities. Talk about how did you get these various roles for which you had no qualifications whatsoever? How does one do that? What's the method?
Well, I tell a story in the book about how when I was a law student, I had served as the reader in British constitutional history for the Columbia College course. And I had asked my friend Marta Rabinowitz, who I see sitting out there, to share it with me. And on the first occasion at which I was to give a talk to the students in the course, I gave my talk, and afterwards Marty said to me, he said, "You know, I know you don't know what you're talking about, and you know you don't know what you're talking about, but that was very impressive." And in the book I say that perception has gotten me through much of life.
So let's talk about these. Sotheby's, Japan Society, American Academy in Rome, and so on.
Each is an accident of typically growing out of a personal relationship. So that the Sotheby's, for example, I was sitting at home one day and I got a call from a friend and Columbia alum, Ira Milstein, whom I'd known for many years. He said, "How'd you like to be chairman of Sotheby's?" I said, "Well, there are a few things I'd like to know." But at that point, this was after my tenure as president, at that point Sotheby's was in deep trouble. They'd been accused of antitrust violations, to which we later pleaded guilty. And what they needed, in the words of one newspaper account, was somebody who was squeaky clean. And since I'd never been indicted, and had, you can't have a reputation for integrity, right? It's only if you do something wrong that your integrity becomes the subject of conversation. But I hadn't, apparently, and they wanted somebody who would project some sense that Sotheby's was going to be law-abiding from then on. I was asked whether I was a collector. I said, well, I can claim to be a window shopper. I mean, even the prices at Sotheby's now are astronomical, but even then they were normally beyond my means. But the need for somebody who would give them some aura of decency was dominant. And by that point, of course, I had shown here at Columbia that I could run something without getting into fresh trouble. And that turned out to be a fascinating assignment. When I was asked to be chair, it wasn't a full-time job. It was the non-executive chairman, and we had a CEO and president, whom we still have. And I was given a lovely conference room as an office. It was a corner office with beautiful light. And I was told this had been used as a place where, when a major collector was being courted, with the prospect of bidding on a great work of art, this is where he or she might be invited to lunch. The work of art would be on the walls, and they would do the pitch. I said, well, I'm not going to be here all the time. If you want to use it while I'm not here, that's fine with me. Selfless act of sharing. What I didn't realize, but came to love, when I went to work, I never knew what I'd find on my office wall. Matisse, Monet. I mean, it was stunning. It really was great. One day, the first time this happened, I called Pat and I said, you got to come to my office and see my Monet. And it was gone the next day.
So the Mondale episode. How could someone so smart play someone so not smart?
We're talking about my being Fritz Mondale, Walter F. Mondale's sparring partner when he was running for president against Ronald Reagan. And I have to say that in reading Reagan's speeches to prepare for this, I decided maybe he wasn't not smart. I mean, the stuff was enormously effective. Fritz had been my student at the University of Minnesota. My first professional job was to walk around the lectern from my senior year here to an assistant professorship at the University of Minnesota. I had a wonderful teacher, Elliot Evans Cheatham, great Southern gentleman. And I had told him that someday I'd like to teach. And to my amazement, he arranged for me to have breakfast with the dean of the University of Minnesota Law School in the fall of my senior year. And that led to an offer, and I went. Anyway, Fritz was back from the Army, and he was a senior when I was a first-year law teacher. And we became friends and stayed in touch over the years. And I suspect that he may have asked me to be his Ronald Reagan because, having been his teacher, I was less likely to be intimidated by him. He was, after all, a former vice president, United States senator, running for president of the United States. And I remember thinking as I went down to Washington to do this, that if the race were close, I'd be nervous.
And other outside activities. Litigation, they talk about the syphilis case.
Yeah, I got a call from Jack Greenberg one day. Jack was then the head of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, having succeeded Thurgood Marshall in that role. And Jack told me that one of the fund's cooperating attorneys, a man by the name of Fred Gray, whom I knew slightly, had been asked by victims of and heirs of victims of the Tuskegee syphilis experiment to represent them. To back up just a moment, there was a moment along in the early 20th century when some Scandinavian scientists had done some work that led them to raise the question of whether syphilis was as serious a disease as was thought. And this led the United States Public Health Service to take a leading role in testing that hypothesis. And the way they tested it was to deny medical care without telling them to several hundred black sharecroppers in Alabama. And the experiment began in the 20s and ran all the way up into the 70s. One might have rationalized it, though still a gross violation of fairness and disclosure, on the theory that there was no effective treatment for syphilis anyway when it started. But this continues after the discovery of penicillin. And it came to light, interestingly enough, when a reporter did a story about it, but it hadn't been a secret. That's one of the extraordinary things. The medical journals had reported on it. One of them was called Plotting the Death Curve on doing the rate at which these patients died off. And so this was the moment for a public accounting. And the case was complex, not least of which because many of the potential plaintiffs were dead, others were scattered. There had been an alleged control group, but the experiment was actually worthless, as it turned out, because of various flaws in its execution. And I have a brilliant colleague named Hal Edgar, who was and is our specialist in medical ethics, and talked to Hal, and we decided we could do it. We could help Fred, and so we signed on. And we put the case together, and then the government, now we're dealing with lawyers, not repentant doctors, so they weren't about to behave like sinners who had seen the light. We had a tough negotiation on our hands. We could have gone to trial and undoubtedly would have prevailed, but it would have taken years, and our clients were dying off. So we ultimately settled the case. You can read about the numbers in the book. It was, I think, the most shocking racial exploitation in American history after the Civil War and the Reconstruction period.
Well, let's open this up for questions. So there are 2 microphones on either side. Anybody can stand up and ask a question.
Congratulations on the book and this wonderful event.
Thank you, John.
This is a quick question. What was Dr. Axel's patent that generated $1 billion?
Can you do that right? It had to do with cloning.
I could say something, but it would be, wildly meaningless. And is Richard? Well, Eric is here. Eric.
I see Eric. Yes, Eric, tell us.
Richard's.
Is Richard there? Oh,
here.
better still.
Richard, we have no idea what you did, so why don't you tell us what you... Isn't it to transfer DNA across?
It was simply when I was a young assistant professor, my students developed an approach by which genes could be introduced into any cell in a form in which they would produce the proteins that they encoded, and that formed the basis for a large part of the recombinant DNA industry.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Other questions? Yes.
Hi, Mike. We've been friends for many years, and I've had many proud moments watching your career, but none exceeded watching you go to the mound in Yankee Stadium to throw out the first ball. Many people who had that chance either throw it into the ground or over the head of the catcher, but you threw a strike. How did that happen?
Practice. My only regret about that occasion is I have no picture. What had happened was that one of our students in the college, Greg Larson, had broken all of Lou Gehrig's records when Larson was an undergraduate, and he was playing for the Minnesota Twins. And Larson, with a single hit, determined the outcome of the World Series in 1 year in the late 80s. He was pinch hitting in the 9th inning of the 7th game and drove in the winning run. This obviously called for an expression of joy from alma mater, and so we decided to give him an alumnus award. And the natural time to do that was when the team was here playing the Yankees. And so we did it at Yankee Stadium. Someone asked whether I'd like to throw out the first ball. Is the Pope Catholic is the answer to that. I still remember sitting in the dugout next to the team and the team photographer, and he was grousing about umpires in the American League. and my name was called on this PA, and I trotted out, and I did whip it in, and I trotted back to the dugout. He said, "You know, with the officiating in this league, that was a strike." I should, in fairness to a former president of the United States, that was the year George Bush had bounced it in Washington. And what I learned was that he was wearing a bulletproof vest, which of course I didn't have to do.
Yes.
Professor Sovern, as a recent graduate of your legal methods class, I'm just wondering, what do you think is the most important lesson you try to teach us innocent 1Ls in those 3 weeks?
Oh, that's a tough one. If I knew the answer to that, I wouldn't want to give it away because everybody would skip the rest. One of the reasons it takes 3 weeks is I can't really encapsulate that. Sorry.
Mike, when you were talking to me about writing the book, and I was talking about where you might read and so on, and you said, well, who's going to be interested? And I said, Mike, don't sell yourself short. And as everyone in this room knows, there's no reason for you to sell yourself short.
This is the man who told me I didn't know what I was talking about. Thank you, Marty. I also should tell another story about him. We had a ferocious first-year teacher in law school. Wonderful teacher, but the old style, intimidating, the way the movies occasionally show it. His name was Jerome Michael, and Marty fell asleep. And I gave him an elbow, and I don't know what possessed me. I said, he called on you. Marty immediately asked him, please repeat the question.
Mike, here's an incident that you don't know about of long ago.
Let's have more of those. The audience should be thinking about incidents he doesn't know about.
I think I was vice dean at the law school. A student came to me and told me that Professor Sovern was after him day and night to do destructive things. And he gave me some particulars, which I did not believe. I finally said to the young man, I believe you're paranoid. He said, you'd be paranoid too if Sovern were after you.
No, I did not know about that, which may be just as well. Thank you, Bill.
Mike, why don't you tell your best show business story? Nobody here has heard anything about you in show business.
Well, let's see. Pat Schoenfeld is referring to the fact that one of the posts for which I was unqualified was first to join the board of the boards of the Schubert Organization and the Schubert Foundation, and then ultimately to become president of the Schubert Foundation. And another Columbia story, really. I was invited to join those boards because the president of the organization and the foundation at the time was Bernie Jacobs, who was a graduate of the Columbia Law School. And we met at one of his reunions, and he invited us to theater. We became friends. Well, before he invited me on board, he had me meet Pat Schoenfeld's husband, who was the chairman of those organizations. We all hit it off, and I joined them. And it's been a wonderful assignment. To give you a little background, the Schubert Foundation was created. I have to tell European friends, it's not Franz. It's the Schubert brothers who built a great theatrical empire so great, in fact, that it violated the antitrust laws
Right.
and was broken up back in the 50s. But the core of it is a group of 17 theaters here in New York City. And the foundation owns the stock in the organization, which owns the theaters. And all of the profits that the theaters generate for the organization are upstreamed to the foundation, and I then have the fun of giving it away. We are the largest supporter of theater and dance in America, funding small grants, but useful, over 300 theater companies, nonprofit, all over the country. And so I tell you all that so the next time you go to the theater and think about the outrageous ticket price, know that if you're in a Schubert theater, that money is going to get recycled to do a lot of good. We also give them money at Columbia.
Other comments, questions?
Open the bar?
There is a reception right behind us in the faculty room. Mike, you know, everybody's here, as I said, because they love you. So it's a really, really wonderful thing that you would write this book, that you would share this evening with us. We really appreciate you very much.
Thank you so much.